I'm in London, I guess your current hometown, and
Yeah.
I, met you as part of the IDMP project, and you were really a great deal of help, at least in us trying to identify and name plants. I really appreciate it. And
the work with FDA.
yeah, with
before the
FDA,
INP.
yeah, and perhaps you can talk about that, about your, the medicinal plant naming service. But talk about yourself first.
Okay.
I mean, where you're from, and
So I did my first degree here in London, Queen Mary College, and then did a PhD at the Natural History Museum in collaboration with the Westminster University. And I was always a mix between a botanist and a computer data person, and we were looking at how computer systems can help identify plant and animal specimens. So it was actually, in some senses, a sort of an earlier form of AI,
sure.
of intelligent thinking about how you choose characteristics to be able to best identify plants. Or
was it from images, or was it?
no, we were mostly trying to build data sets with descriptors of height or length or hairiness or colour or
Great.
And then I was in Mexico running database projects there for a while, and then came to the University of Southampton in the UK. Where we ran and built some really quite novel data sets. Back in the day, they were novel in that it was an attempt to bring together information about the morphology and the chemistry and the ecology of a particular group of plants based around a good nomenclature and taxonomy. And we started off with one tribe of the legume family, and then for the vici, which is peas and beans and lentils, we did that in Southampton. But ultimately that grew into an international consortium with about 80 different legume systematists contributing data, and I led the data
looking for
aspects of
medicinal properties or
No,
use?
it wasn't particularly medicinal at that point. It was just all legume species. So yeah. And any sort of use.
And of course, the Mexican yam played a major role in the.
Yeah. So again, that was more to do with the identification work in Mexico. But at that point, I then moved to Kew. And Kew was the place to be because it is a very, very large organisation. It has well over 500 research scientists studying plants and fungi. There are physiologists and there are seed folk, there are anatomists, there are chemists, ecologists, climate people, mathematicians, chemists, looking at the natural products, chemistry of these things, and DNA. So they have got one of their information products currently, for example, is relatively recent, is a thing called the Tree of Life, which is plotting all plant and fungal life on a tree, which is based upon
and sequencing all of them, and hopefully
detailed sequences,
detailed
much
sequencing.
more detailed information than in barcodes and so forth. So it's actually using about something like 360 different genes are analysed to produce those sequences, unlike just the 2 or 3 genes that occur in the standard barcode work. So that's one thing that Kew does, but there is so many, and it is because it's been around a long time, 250 years. It is sort of a centre of a network of botanical research globally, and it has some responsibilities. And one of those responsibilities is to document the alternative scientific names that are given to plants or to fungi, and then bring those different scientific names together into a database to say how many of those relate to the same plant. So there's one set of databases for just the names that have been published. So you can ask questions about, is this a scientific name? Who published it? Where did they publish it? What is the type specimen that proves what this is? And that will be in a place like Kew or New York Botanical Garden or in Sao Paulo. And then the next set of databases are around the taxonomy. So each entry in the database, if you like, is a plant. Where is it found? Is it native in France? Is it introduced? Is it a tree or a herb or a shrub? And what is the current scientific name that botanists would prefer you to use for that plant, given our understanding of the evolutionary pathways and the molecular biology, the genetics? And what are the equivalent scientific names that are the synonyms of that plant? So one of the challenges in dealing with natural products, what we'll come on to later, is that if you go to important medical resources such as PubMed
Sure.
and look for information on a plant which is known to be used medicinally with a scientific name, you will retrieve actually only 20% of the information that is stored in PubMed about that plant.
Right, because the names.
Because they're citing literature,
Yeah,
which
is
uses
all over the place.
all those other different names.
Yeah.
So it's only from our work at Kew and our website can you go to PubMed and confidently retrieve all of the information within PubMed about a particular plant. So again, yeah. But I'm getting ahead.
Sure. And Kew holds the hard samples of these plants, which everything will be based on, and eventually it will be tied to its genetic information. I mean, the one thing
Yes.
we've always had a problem with is, the names, as you know, evolve over time.
Yes.
And to us, we want to tie it to
That's
what
important,
the actual
Larry.
material is. And,
Yes.
and that's
So I
been
guess
sort of our challenge.
my world is I think about all the time about names and
Sure.
common names like
Yeah.
bluebell
Right.
that my gran would have used is a different plant in Scotland and it's a
Right.
different plant again in California and a different plant in South Africa. So common names are just part of language.
Sure.
And they evolve.
Yeah.
And there's no right or wrong.
Right,
You know,
right.
so my bluebell is different from yours,
Yeah.
but neither of us are wrong.
Sure.
Pharmaceutical names, bizarrely, often written in Latin, are no better because there is no formal way of these names being registered.
Yeah.
And so they are effectively common names written in a posh language. So the beauty of scientific names for plants is they refer to a single plant. Yes, they're written in Latin, but that's almost irrelevant. The key is that they are published in a formal way and they cite a particular specimen or a number of specimens. And we call those type specimens. And so what does that Latin name mean that's written on the page? It means that plant. It's the physical reference point for what the name means. What is its flower colour? Does it have funny hairs on the underside of the leaves? And what is its DNA?
Sure.
Everything is defined by those collections. So Kew has one of the larger herbaria, which are these collections of dead plants. It has collections of economic botany, so medicinal products, hats, walking sticks. It has the most diverse seed bank in the world. It's not as big as the one in Svalbard for crops in terms of the volume of seed, but in terms of the number of species that are represented, by far the biggest is managed by colleagues at Kew, and the biggest DNA bank in terms of the diversity of species for which we have the DNA extracted is managed.
And is there a priority on sequencing? Are they going after medicinal plants, the economic plants, or is
the seed bank do tend to focus on plants which are known to be threatened for the conservation, but also their use for whatever purpose is a criterion for them to bank seeds.
Okay.
But it is also about access and where they will find partners in countries where it can be more difficult, either in terms of the logistics, but also often of the legislation. So the deal would ordinarily be that the plants are the seed is harvested and split 50-50 between the hosts and Kew, and so that it's stored locally in that country and at Kew. But then, in terms of the DNA stuff, the Tree of Life project that I mentioned that they're doing, they are focusing there on one species in every genus of plant and one species in every genus of fungi.
Okay.
So they've got, initially, they will have a spread across the whole phylogenetic tree.
Yeah.
Having said that,
and how many genuses of plants are there? Just a ballpark
maybe
figure.
Caught me out. I'm sorry. I've no idea.
No idea.
Absolutely no
There's
idea.
a number of them. There's a number of them.
And so it is important that we have a representation of each of those, and you can go to the Kew Herbarium and find some sample of each of those genera, not every species.
Sure.
So there are about 300. Going back to my point about lots of different names, there are about 350,000 species of plant known, and something like 1.4 million scientific names.
Sure.
So on average, there's 4 scientific names for every plant. But if you look at medicinal plants,
Yeah.
which have been well studied, and people, because of there's a lot of study, they keep changing the
Yeah.
names and so forth. There's something
And there could
like,
be
there's
many
10.
plants for a common name, which is
Even common names.
yeah.
But I'm just talking about
Sure,
scientific
sure,
names now.
right,
There's
right,
10 names for every
Yeah,
medicinal plant,
yeah.
which gets in the way if
Sure.
you're looking for information. And gets in the way if you're using one name and I'm using another
Right.
name. And so the work that you were doing with IDMP
Right.
is all about that. It's
Sure.
saying, okay,
Yeah.
so FDA are using these names
Yeah.
for the plants and they're using these names for the drugs, the herbal
Yeah.
drugs, and EMA are using a different set. So
Right,
we
right.
can do
It was
that
a real
mapping.
problem, and I guess you looked at our data and found a
Yeah.
number of misnaming or mismapping.
It was very
names.
good. The FDA data
It was good.
actually
We
was
tried to do a good job.
compared with other regulators.
Yeah,
It was
yeah, sure.
extremely good
Yeah,
data.
yeah.
Nevertheless,
Yeah.
there were something like 10% of those names which were ambiguous or not precise. And more interesting, I think, is that there were about, I don't remember the exact figures, but I think it was something like at least 25 different plants were listed by FDA under multiple names.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of your lists, they were thought to be different plants,
But they were
but
the same.
actually
Yeah.
they were the same
Yeah.
plant.
Well, my colleague Frank Switzer did a great job. I had very little to do with it,
No.
but but he
Yeah.
was the one who did most of it.
And he
ex-wife
continues
was a
to do so.
botanist. Yeah,
Yeah,
and he
correct.
still
So he was
does
aware
that,
of
and
that.
hopefully he's in better communication with you and stuff.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
that
Well,
now.
since we've
Sure.
done the collaboration, I think that's obviously improved.
Yeah,
and we've
no, that's
removed
great.
that.
That's great, Bob.
So, so the interest in medicinal plants, I think, really came. Well, there's a number of reasons for doing it, actually. But so let me hold on to the first thought. Whilst I was at Kew, I had strong links in Latin America. Kew were working in Brazil. They had a lot of collaboration with Brazilian botanists and taxonomists. But Kew's director at that time, Sir Guillaume France, was very keen for Kew to get back to basics and work with applied botany and the use of plants. And we devised this collaboration with about 40 different applied research institutions around northeastern Brazil, which is an area about the size of Western Europe, 9 different states,
Yeah.
semi-arid,
Yeah.
with a lot of rural poor communities. And the objective really was to document what is the biodiversity with traditional botany, but also to look at the uses of these plants. And my question that my team will ask is: so what information does science hold, which can complement the knowledge of the local farmers, the local people about these plants? And it was very interesting that if you go into a rural community and ask them what are their problems, one of them always coming up regularly was food for their goats, because it's a dry area, and at 9-10 months of the year there's no rain. So how do you sustain a goat herd in the during
So this
that dry
wasn't
period?
Amazonia, which
No,
is also
very,
in the
very
Northeast. It's a
different.
different sort of area in Brazil.
Different in terms of its climate, and its form is very semi-arid or even very dry in parts, but also different from culturally, and I'll come to that in a minute. So one goat forage was one really important key, but the other was medicinal plants. So you go to any rural community in the northeast and talking with them, and we ran workshops, and we had brips on the floor and charts and storylines. It was great.
Sure.
I really thoroughly enjoyed that work. But medicinal plants was a very high priority to them. And it was often the women that held the knowledge, and we were able to promote what they were doing. And there was a Brazilian chemist who was from northeastern Brazil, Professor Matos, who was a wonderful, charismatic guy. And he had this program called Farmacias Vivas, living pharmacies.
Sure.
So he was anxious that Brazilian people were taking herbal remedies which were not safe. They were doing it just from hearsay.
And that's often the only medicine they have there, though,
And
right?
it is they can't afford the bus ride, let alone the aspirin.
Yeah.
So he was trying to say, well, what plants do we know are safe and there is some evidence of efficacy, and then promote their use. And so he would grow them in the university botanic garden and find out how you did that, and then take those plants into the communities and show them how to look after them and establish very simple, basic pharmacies.
Yeah, sure.
So how do you make the tea? How do you make the
Yeah.
soap? How
That's
do you
fantastic, yeah.
And then the communities which were poor would be able to take those products, they use them themselves, but also sell them in the richer districts. So
And it hasn't been codified into pharmacopoeias,
so it's been picked up by the Brazilian government. It's not very active,
sure.
Plug for my article in Herbalgram. You can read about it a little bit there.
Okay, great. Yeah.
And so it's, and sadly, Professor Matos has since died, but his work lives on,
Sure.
and he's very well recognised.
Uh-huh.
The interesting thing for me, a surprise for me in northeastern Brazil, was that the medicinal plants that people were using were not largely Brazilian plants.
Okay.
They were plants from Africa
Sure.
or plants from Europe.
Okay, wow. Yeah.
And that's because the people in northeastern Brazil are descended from slaves and descended from Europeans.
Yeah.
So the knowledge about what plants are useful and how to use them is derived from your forebears.
Yeah.
So it's a very, very different situation from
and
the
this
Amazon.
is a model that may be able to get transferred to certain communities in Africa or something that are also...
So they were learning. Obviously, there is knowledge has been transferred over generations from Africa.
Sure.
Yeah. The common names of the plants might reflect what the common name was back in Africa.
Sure. Yeah.
And there's lovely work done on that, about how the names can indicate, the etymology of the name will indicate its use and where it has come from. But I think it's very interesting. I mean, I like the thought that you can go into a shop here in London and buy a traditional Chinese medicine for a plant that is actually a European native plant. It's not a Chinese plant at all. And it was taken to China along the Silk Road.
Sure.
Generations and generations.
Yeah,
And then the Chinese found something different to do with it.
Yeah.
So knowledge is very difficult. And I know that some countries are anxious about protecting the IP and their traditional knowledge, and rightly so.
Sure, yeah.
But it is a challenge but where in northeastern Brazil, where does that knowledge actually belong? Is it northeastern Brazil or is it Portugal or Holland? And what about the communities that are using exactly the same plants in the same way in Peru or Colombia? They have to have a say as well.
Yeah.
So globally, actually establishing ownership of some of these ideas when it is actually mankind is really, really
it should
difficult.
benefit from it. It should be a global effort. And the problems with plant using them is...
So I think there are really important, strong cultural components to this. So there is Western medicine, which is based upon science and slowly accreting new pieces of information and evidence. And the process has become that aspirin, for example, is a single molecule.
Sure.
We understand it extremely well, and we know which body systems it is targeting.
Yeah.
And measuring the efficacy of that is achievable.
It has, but we're not even sure the exact dose of aspirin in the U.S. and it differs in Europe.
But you can do an experiment.
We can do an experiment.
You can do a clinical trial,
and
show
some effect,
and show that. And actually, some of those modern drugs, in fact, a reasonable number of them, have been derived from traditional remedies.
Sure, yeah.
So one of the collections that Kew holds is of Indian medicinal plants that were brought back with the East India community.
Sure.
And we've been doing a very interesting project with our Indian counterparts, looking at, so what was an Ayurvedic drug called back then, during the British Raj, and what plants were being used, and are they the same plants that are being now used for that same Ayurvedic drug, or the drug with the same Ayurvedic name?
Sure, yeah.
And you see both trends. There are changes to the plants that are being used, and the changes in the names, inevitably.
Sure.
But it is interesting. But what, of course, some of those Scottish surgeons that went out with the British Empire to protect the soldiers and protect the Europeans that were living there, they were using herbal medicines because that's all that existed. And they learnt a great deal. And they would go around the markets and collect these traditional remedies and then bring them back to the Western. And some of those became, they are, if not the actual, they are the inspiration of a very large number of the drugs that we use today.
Artemisinin with malaria, just,
As one example.
Yeah, as one example. Ivermectin, there's...
Western medicine has moved on.
Sure.
And now considers plant-based medicines as to be suspect.
Right.
Because there is not evidence. Mm-hmm. And they are driven by the need for evidence. Mm-hmm. And I, as a scientist, I absolutely get that.
Sure.
Natural products based on a plant often do lack evidence. Despite the fact that they are natural, they are not necessarily safe.
Absolutely.
Many of them have toxic compounds within them. You can overdose just as you can. So they are just like any other medicine. They have.
Sure.
The real challenge, as I perceive as a scientist, is that a single plant is a very rich soup of different chemicals.
Yeah.
Some of which we know about.
Yeah.
And many of which we do not. They may not even be known to science.
Yeah. Well, I'm a chemist, and plants are much better chemists than I can be. I mean, they synthesize things.
They are little You're right. They're little factories.
Great deal of difficulty doing, and
because to produce a particular fancy molecule, which has an impact and frightened off insects originally, that was its purpose. There is a whole pathway, a chemical pathway in the plant.
That's right.
And those are inherited from one generation to the next, and ultimately from one species to the species which replaces it in geological time. So it is fascinating and extremely complicated, and the science is not clever enough, it's not good enough yet
many of our
to identify all those chemicals. And so taking a cup of chamomile tea is something stepping into the unknown.
Yeah.
That's the point.
We don't know what component puts you to sleep in chamomile tea or is supposed to.
So people make assumptions.
Sure.
And so I have an Indian nutritional friend who's she always tells this story. Tumeric.
Sure.
Okay, so she makes her meal in the evening for 6 people, and she puts a little bit of turmeric into the pot, and it's ground root turmeric and goes in. And that's probably about as much. So that's 6. That little spoonful of turmeric in a big, great pot of food, divided by 6 people, is probably as much as the body can absorb.
Right.
But it is a mixture. It is the ground root. It has a whole bunch of different chemicals in it.
Sure. Yeah.
And then you've got these extracts being sold, which have got curcumin in it. They're not turmeric at all.
Sure. Right.
They've just made the assumption that the benefits of turmeric is this molecule because they know about it. Yeah. And then they sell that.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's a very different.
And the bioavailability of that. I mean, I looked into that a little bit. You need to add piperidol, which comes from black pepper, in order to get anything absorbed.
Right.
And,
I didn't know.
Yeah.
No. So I think the challenge, I think, in terms of the science is the evidence base. And then, of course, some Ayeurdic treatments or traditional Chinese medicines were themselves built upon a number of different plants used all at once, either in combination or one or the other and so forth. And so there are quite a degree of uncertainty about what other chemicals are being taken and how they impact on the body. And although we do know an awful lot about how the human body works today, we're still learning more.
Sure, right.
And so in terms of the immune system, what is the function of, I don't know, the spleen, for example.
Right. Yeah, you can live without it, but it still does something. Yeah.
So I'd rather have it than not,
Yeah, right.
So that's a real challenge. But in the space that you have been working in terms of regulation of medicines, obviously, as you've just said, it's a very few products that actually make it through that regulatory process. Yeah. But in the marketplace, there are huge numbers of these supplements, often the same herbal. So a herbal substance I define as being a known species, the part of that species treated in a certain way. And that is effectively a definition of a herbal substance. And different pharmacopoeia will define those substances in slightly different ways, how you actually prepare it. Nevertheless, the way that those are defined in different pharmacopoeia, even for herbal medicines, which are particularly well regulated compared with the food supplements or the dietary supplements, is variable. And they give these drug substances names, and they're used inconsistently. So Sisamafuga rhizome is used in the Chinese pharmacopoeia to refer to a drug based upon 4 different species. The same Latin name appears in the Japanese pharmacopoeia and refers to a drug based upon 5 different plants. So it's those 4 and another 5th species. Sisamafuga rhizome is used in the European pharmacopoeia and consequently the US pharmacopoeia to mean a drug based on a completely different plant.
Wow.
So it's the same Latin name.
Uh-huh.
You can go to the pharmacopoeia and get
Sure.
a very, very fancy 3-page definition of how to produce this, but they're using different plants.
Yeah. And Commission E with the Germans, I mean, is that a great standard? I mean,
The
Commission E monographs or
they do well, and I think that pharmacists in particular countries have done well.
Right.
The challenge is they're not talking the same language.
Yeah.
So my point now is not so much around the definition of what the herbal substance is, but rather there is no common nomenclature,
and that was the IDMP
terminology,
project.
and that's where IDMP came
We're
in.
supposed to, and we've still taken a long time to implement it. It's kind of an embarrassment for me. I've been involved in it for 18
It has
years,
been
and
a
it
long
still
time.
hasn't really been implemented.
Yeah, I remember you and Barry Hammond and me telling this was a game changer, and in 5 years' time, but I know how that is.
Sure, yeah.
So what we did at Kew was that we come back to what does Kew have? Its strengths.
Sure.
It has these standard references for plant names and the plant taxonomy.
Yeah.
And those are used by and contributed by botanists in every country in the world. They are the global standard.
Yeah.
But they are only useful and only presented in a way that makes sense to botanists. So the scientific nomenclature makes no sense to a herbal regulator or to a forester or to an agronomist.
Yeah.
So what we realised was that we talk about plant name services in a sense that let's take this data and make it more accessible, more intelligible to professional audiences that have got a really important job to do and need access to all of this.
Yeah.
And so Medicinal Plant Name Services was born from that conviction.
Yeah.
And it could have been, frankly, it could have been in ecology, it could have been in agriculture, but we were fortunate enough to get some funding from the Wellcome Trust here in the UK as a seed funding to build the very first versions of MPNS, which is when we reached out to you. So that was back in 2012.
Yeah.
And that funding ran out in 2014, and here we are 10 years later.
And you're still doing
and we're still doing it. Every year we
it.
produce a new
and
version.
And there was a real catastrophe that happened in Belgium. And
And that was around the ambiguity in pinyin names, actually, from the Chinese pharmacopoeia. Yeah, so in fact, Kew's has a fabulous collection of traditional Chinese medicines. It rivals collections in China. And the beauty of that collection is that they have the specimen that is associated with that herbal remedy. So the identity of the plant is proven. And the challenge in herbal medicines and food supplements even more so is that there is very little control of the quality of these products being sold. And so it is a challenge when you go into a store in a Chinese medicinal stock here in London and they're selling you a white powder. How do you know what is actually in there? Do they have the right plant or not? And it is then that what we call authentication services kick in. And the authentication may be to do with the DNA, because we've got the DNA of the original material. It may be the chemistry, that actually gives you the clue as to which plants are not there. But interestingly, a company sent a big batch of ginseng to Kew just to test. They bought this ginseng, but they needed to know it really was ginseng. So they took it into the laboratory, and the chemists looked at it, and they did this profiling, and they got exactly the peak that they would have expected if that was ginseng, just as the pharmacopoeia told them to test for.
Right.
So they were just about to write the report to the company, say, yes, you've got ginseng.
Yeah.
When my colleague Chris Leon walked through the laboratory, and she's an anatomist,
Sure.
she looked at those roots
Uh-huh.
and she said, no way are they ginseng.
Correct. Yeah.
She recognized that morphologically. And what had happened was that the supplier had bought parsnips or something really cheap, and they looked a bit like ginseng, and then they dipped
Spiked
them
it with,
into a dilute lucent. And
Yeah.
this adulteration of these materials to sort of sell a valuable product
Sure.
is increasing all the time as the American Botanical
Right,
Congress
right.
are working at. No,
Yeah, I think there
that's
was a study by USP too that looked at a
Yeah.
lot of herbals, and
But-
probably half of them weren't. what they
Chris's
claimed
work
to be.
and Kew's involvement
Sure,
came
yeah.
directly because
Sure.
of these problems
Yeah,
in the
yeah,
Chinese
right,
medicine
right,
and the
right.
health regulator in the
Yeah.
UK needing
Yeah.
some advice. And how do we identify these plants and what are the problems? And one that we became aware of is the one I think that you referred to earlier was associated with a Belgian slimming clinic, and they needed a traditional Chinese medicine product, which they ordered, and they used the pinyin name. Now, pinyin is a transliteration of the Chinese name. There are two products in the Chinese pharmacopoeia with slightly different Chinese names, but once they're transliterated into pinyin, they end up with the same name. So the pinyin name is ambiguous. And so the slimming clinic was unaware of that, and they ordered the drug using that common name, and they got the wrong one. And the result of that were more than 100 people on dialysis, and two people died as a result of using the wrong drug at the wrong dosages, because many of these will have toxicity problems with them, of course. And this illustrates the sorts of challenges. I'm working with a really fascinating guy who's built a database of edible fungi. And what does edible mean?
Sure. Yeah.
And some of them are reported as toxic in some instances, and some of them are reported as not toxic elsewhere.
Yeah.
So if you cook it and then it's edible, does that make it toxic or not toxic? And of course, it's how much you eat actually makes it toxic. So there's complexities about this, what apparently really quite simple, stark statements. And so there are people that are anxious not to put toxic onto databases such as ours because it will frighten people off. But on the other hand, you need to be able to point to the evidence that there is that under these circumstances, uncooked in a certain volume, it's not going to be good for you. And, and so there is complexity in all of this.
And fungi are becoming very popular now, at least in the U.S., for cognitive, for ADHD, for other things, and whether they're actually what they say they are, you really don't know.
No. So one of my colleagues at Kew is looking specifically at the psychological aspects of some of the other, and she's carried out actually clinical trials here in the UK using mixtures of some traditional herbal remedies here, and looked at the impact on Alzheimer's, for example, and slowing the loss of efficacy. There's good evidence for that. So, but how that happens is a question which science is not able to answer yet. You can observe the impact and measure it, but you don't know how that is happening.
Lion's mane mushrooms become very popular in the U.S. because they think it
there's lots of
cognitive ability. And
there's lots of popular things and lots of myth. And I think it's so difficult for the general public to differentiate. So names, again, I'm obsessed with names. Sorry, Larry, to come back to this. But you walk into a store, even well-known stores such as Boots or Holland & Barrett here in the UK, and try and find a herbal product, you will see that you can find the same product on the shelf with completely different names. So how the consumer does not know how to compare those things. Or worse still, you find a single name is being used for products based upon different plants. So there are products on the market in the West, UK, US, which have got ginseng in the name, based on around 20 different plant species with completely different chemistries and completely different uses. But for the man in the street, the woman in the street, this is how would they know?
Right.
So the labeling of these products is absolutely critical.
Yeah.
And we as professionals need to be pressing the legislators much harder to ensure a rigorous level of testing. And so there are good companies around that are doing their absolute best to make high quality products from the right plants, but they're not benefiting from that because there's lots of rubbish. With people, the sort of colleagues that you probably know, Michael Heinrich, for example, at the London School of Pharmacy, they've tested lots of these popular remedies and food supplements. Some of them have got just cardboard in them.
Sure, yeah.
And many have got the wrong plant and so forth. So
even with cinnamon, you see people spiking just regular wood and calling it cinnamon, and
a bit like the ginseng example I gave you earlier on. So it's ensuring, giving the public confidence about these products.
Yeah.
And so now there is an Australian foundation which is relatively new.
Sure.
And it is looking to try and promote the quality control of these products and to give them kite stamps.
Yeah.
And one component of that model is that the company are using meaningful names at the beginning of the process. And that's where we come in. So we're able to help them at that stage. Yeah. So you can only test something if it's authenticated, if you know what they claim it to be.
Yeah.
And if they say ginseng, well, so which ginseng do you mean?
Sure.
Before you can start testing whether it is or not.
Yeah.
And then at the other end is how are they labeling their product? And is that name unique and meaningful? And that's, again, so we come in at that very end. So it's a minor role we play. We're not doing the laboratory work.
Right.
But we are able to facilitate that sort of
But it's going to be backed by laboratory work that will at least give a more permanent kind of sense of what something is.
So Kew is in a good place to do it because it has the reference collections, those herbarium specimens I've talked about.
Right.
It's not so easy to do if you're just a large pharmaceutical company with a very sophisticated chemical laboratory, but you don't have the plants as a reference because you need to be able to compare.
Yeah, maybe you can talk a little about your new effort that excited me a few years ago, and I guess you finally got funding for it, was Plants for Health.
So one of the challenges, I confess, with Medicinal Plant Name Services, it's still going, 10 years on, version 14 is just about to come out the door, new version every year, lots of use, natural product chemists, ecologists, conservationists, etc. Yeah. But funding it and keeping it going is hard work.
Yeah.
And so one of the drivers for this new project, we call Plants for Health, was a recognition that having a bigger audience and a larger number of partner organisations and a larger number of users would facilitate our fundraising to keep this exercise going. And the other is the recognition that so many food supplements, as I said before, are actually the same herbal substance as a medicine. So what are the plants? What are the substances? What are they called in this country or that country or in that discipline or that discipline? We've already got for Medicinal Plant Name Services. It's a small step to extend it to include the food supplements because they're basically the same plants.
Yeah, they are. Yeah,
just slightly different
names. In the US, if you call it a dietary supplement, you can almost market anything. If you can say it's natural, if it came.
So we've extended Medicinal Plant Name Services concept to clover plants and fungi, and medicines, supplements, cosmetics, toxicity. So any aspect in which fungi or plants impact upon human health, that's what we're there for. That's our scope.
Okay.
And in addition to the very modest amount of information that we have from MPNS, which is all the alternative names and the plant parts and the preparations and so forth, we are also in Plants for Health going to give a little bit more information around the toxicity, around the classes of molecule which are stored, the bioactive compounds. We are recording also which species are known to be substitutes for the others. Great, and we think that's really important in helping the trade differentiate between a species which is the right species for that particular medicine or one that is often substituted for it. So,
and perhaps I don't want you to get bashing anybody, but I mean, in the U.S., I mean, our dietary supplements group and the foods group, they use herbs of commerce for a lot of things, and that's actually the name that goes on the label. Oftentimes, is an herb of commerce use.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you think? It is a deficient resource, or you think can be misleading, or what's your thoughts on that?
It's raised the profile of the nomenclatural problem, which is great. And this third edition, which is relatively recent, is a very, very significant advance on what went before. They've obviously used a lot of our data. We are hoping to collaborate with them with the next edition and provide the scientific nomenclature, at least for them. I see two challenges, really, for them, and US in particular. And that is that their objective, as I understand it, and maybe I would be corrected, but I understand them to say that they want to standardize the common names. So they recognize that industry relies on common names, does not use the botanical scientific name. And so they're going to provide the right name.
That's what they do, yeah.
I do not believe that it is possible to establish the right common name.
Okay, great, yeah.
So because it is cultural.
Yeah.
And the US is importing material from all over the world where they speak different languages, they have different cultures. And I can tell you that my grand's version of Bluebell for her is the right version.
Yeah.
You're not going to convince my gran that Bluebell from California is the right one. So I think they're up against a nasty rock that is not going to be shifted in terms of actually trying to establish a common name, which is a standard.
Yeah.
And they can't. Yeah, they rely on plant materials coming in from all over.
Yeah. For Plants for Health, I mean, one of the things that Paul and I are interested in is, of course, efficacy, or whether something really works, or things like that.
Yes.
How do you see, you said you're going to get into that a little bit, or the use of these things, and whether,
So in terms
are you going to tie it to conditions, to cosmetic use, or things like that?
So their use as a medicine. So, as you know from MPNS, we cite all of the reference sources.
You do.
So,
you do a great job.
Most pharmacopoeias are there. You can go to the third edition of the Chinese pharmacopoeia, see what they thought should have been used in that drug.
Right.
And that will differ from the fourth edition of the Chinese pharmacopoeia, let alone the Taiwan pharmacopoeia. So we do reference all of these things, and so we will say that this plant is known to be used as a medicine. This plant is also being registered as a food, or as a traditional food, or as a dietary supplement, or as a cosmetic. We will point to the various categories at a high level of use, and we will also record in Plants for Health some of the detail about that use, but we will not be recording the actual specific. It is for malaria, and you do
or
it.
if there are clinical trials based on it, or you're not going to go into what the efficacy has been shown. And
that's too big a job.
Okay,
I think it's just too big a job. And Kew is I think trying to create the encyclopedia of Plants for Health is a job which humanity will struggle with.
Sure.
As a database digital guy, I see us as the index. It's the route into other people's data. So from MPNS, you can point to the Pittsburgh Natural Products Chemical Database. You can point to FDA. You can point to the UMC's pharmacovigilance trials. You can point and find those plants in those systems, regardless the fact that they all use different names. So we are the point of entry to these other systems.
But you will capture what the proposed uses have been, or that you found anywhere, even in cosmetics, or
and the other way that we can help
wrinkles, or
So the other way that we can help, I think, is by providing that indexing tool means that you can find information.
Sure.
It's not only validating people, but you can
find
it. And so that means that you can come in currently through MPNS, and once we've launched the Plants for Health will be exactly the same. You can then go to PubMed and find all of the literature and all of the clinical trials that relate to that plant, regardless of whatever name was used in the
that was our whole idea, kind of Unicode, that that would be how you would represent something as a more of a code than a name, because names are misleading oftentimes, backed by a definition somewhere that will be.
So a Unicode is, or a code of some sort, is useful internally within a database.
Right,
hang on to. Right. The challenge is that the literature exists using names.
You have to deal with that. So you have to capture names. Sometimes, they're ambiguous names. Or used the same thing for many different things. So,
and the taxonomy is complicated, I think, so much more so than the chemistry in this regard. So, so I think we discussed actually some years ago a case of acacia.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So acacia is it's called gum arabic. It's in the US pharmacopoeia. It's in the European pharmacopoeia, and there's this lovely description of it. It says you come from Acacia senegal or Acacia dazirii or other species of acacia. Now, when they published that, there are probably 300 different species of acacia, and so according to their definition, you could use any one of those. Today, because the taxonomists have been looking at the molecular biology, the DNA of these plants, acacia is no longer a genus of 300 species. It's an acacia of about 100 species. And what was Acacia senegal is not in acacia.
Sure.
So the US Pharmacopoeia is suggesting that you use a plant and any of the other genus, but not the species in the same genus as acacia, what is called Acacia senegal. So this evolution of the nomenclature is present in the literature, and a challenge, I think, for the regulators, which is why we try and give you an update and point out the challenges.
Bacteria is grown under a lot of
bacteria is really complicated.
It's really complicated.
We're not going to go there.
The
fungi is a challenge enough.
It's 8 different species now or something.
Yeah,
no, that's great, Bob. Well, I really appreciate you doing this, man. And,
it's
short notice, and hopefully it wasn't too painful.
No, I hope, and I wish you well with your enterprise. And obviously, we are keen to work with people in this industry and provide them with information and partner as widely as we can.
Yeah, no, that's great, and hope to help you and continue collaborating with you.
Absolutely.
Great. Bob.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks a bunch.
All the best.
Yeah, great.